Today's presentation, I want to give credit to Ted Naiman and Ivor Cummins because they have taught me a lot in addition to my patients. So what we're going to do today is to take a deep dive into insulin resistance and fat cells, because the fat cells are the ones that control your insulin. So before, we have talked about what kind of food that leads to malnutrition. We'll spend a little time on sedimentation. We've also talked how medical profession is leading us astray by giving you medicines that I consider to be extremely bad, Lipitor, insulin, or other statins. We'll talk about why in certain situations these drugs can be bad. We have previously talked about sleep. We have talked about the importance of sunlight. Stress is something that I know nothing how to treat, as I've told you. So bulk will be malnutrition, but what is sedimentation? Sedimentation is lack of activity. Paul Keegan out there and my cycling friends don't know what sedimentation is because they don't get muscle weakness. Their sarcopenia means that their muscles get atrophied, get smaller. Another thing that is a benefit of exercise is that there are certain organelles in our muscles which are called mitochondria. So mitochondria is like an engine in a car. That's what burns fuel. So if you're not physically active, if you're eating a lot of sugar or glucose, what happens is that these mitochondrial density, that means the engines that are there inside the cells, decrease in number. On the other hand, if you see Mr. Keegan exercise, you can see that he has a large amount of mitochondria because he can exercise forever. Another aspect of sedimentation is frailty, also osteoporosis, because if you don't exercise, you lose bone mass. All right. So we're going to start out by telling you how most of my patients eat. This is how I eat, and some of you I can see in the audience eat like this. Chunk of meat, this we have talked about before. This is egg yolks with butter. So this is what Andrea Seinfeld, one of my heroes, eats. And this is his blood sugar after he ate. And you can see that the blood sugar never really went up. This is 6 hours, started at 90, ended at 90. Now you've seen this slide also before. He talks at the Bariatric Society, which is society in which you cut your stomach into a size of a fist. And when he went there, he ate a tuna sandwich, which is brown, that is wheat bread, whole wheat bread. He ate this yogurt, which is non-fat yogurt, which is the predominant yogurt that is found in the doctor's lounge. In fact, I don't think you can get full-fat yogurt. He ate the apple. He said he didn't eat the Snickers bar. This is what happened to his blood sugar. Blood sugar went up to almost 200, came down by about 4 hours, and he started feeling hungry because his sugar dipped. Whereas with this diet, he was not hungry for the entire hours. So you have also seen this slide before. It doesn't project very well, but basically there is one macronutrient out there amongst protein, fat, and carbohydrates. That is the macronutrient that does not increase your blood sugar levels. And the one out there is fat. You have also seen this slide. This is a young lady who is insulin deficient. She's a type 1 diabetic. And for about 30 years, she was injecting insulin into her thighs. And insulin on one thigh one day and the second thigh the other day. And after 30 years of injecting insulin, what is there on her thighs? That is fat, because that's the local action of insulin in depositing fat. We've talked about the Zucker mice before. In fact, I take you through the story of Zucker mice every single time. And what the Zucker mice is a mice that has high insulin levels. It is insulin resistant. So when you feed a Zucker mice food ad lib, just like a normal mouse, the mouse gets fat. So the question that I turn around and ask you guys is that, since it's a mice and you can control how much they eat, if you reduce the amount of food that he ate to about 80% of the normal mice, will he get fat? And the answer that most of you give is yes. And the reason it gets fat is because the high insulin levels drive the deposition of fat at the expense of eating into its muscles and into the heart, and at the expense of activity. So in other words, if you give a Zucker mouse fewer calories than he needs, he will sit in one place. If you put food at the other end of the pen, it will waddle up to that place, eat, and sit there. So we talked about that also. Now, here is the new information. So if you take me or anybody in this room and you drain the entire blood in my body, it'll be about 5 liters. So if you drain my blood, it'll be 5 liters. How much sugar do you think will be there in the entire 5 liters of any of us? And the answer is out here. It's about 1 teaspoon. So what I mean to say by that is that the amount of sugar in our bloodstream is tightly regulated by increasing the levels of insulin so that the sugar is driven into the cells, that the sugar doesn't remain in the bloodstream. The second question is that how much ability do we have to store sugar? In other words, since we don't want sugar in the blood and we want to store sugar, how much sugar can we store? So sugar is stored as glycogen, which is multiple molecules of sugar put together, and our liver is the predominant organ that stores sugar, and it's about 100 grams. That means 400 calories. A normal male eats about 2,000 calories. 400 calories is 1/5 the amount of calories that you need in a 24-hour period. So you don't even store enough sugar for it to last for 24 hours. This is a very important point. Okay? Now people like Mr. Keegan can store a lot of sugar in their muscles, but even he has improved by having metabolic flexibility. He's gone from a carb-heavy diet to a fat-heavy diet, so he's burning fat while he's exercising. But let us say he was not burning fat and he was completely sugar dependent. How many calories of sugar do you think he can store in his muscles? And usually a sedentary individual can store about 200. He can probably push it to about 400. So the total carbs we can store is about 100 grams because muscle glycogen is reserved for the muscles and cannot be used by other organs like the brain. All right, so an average adult usually consumes about 300 grams of sugar, 266 they say, but 300. And about 120 of that is carbs. And the way we eat it, about 120 is sugar. So what we eat is sugar, flour, this is the vegetable oil, and when you put this together, you are just eating a donut. And then also grains, and what I call a sugary fruit. So I'm going to sit here and say fruit is bad for you because the sugary fruit that we eat is fructose. Fructose leads to insulin resistance. It does all the bad things that we will talk about in a little bit. So basically, we have the perfect, what we call the trifecta of 60% of calories coming from grains, sugar, or plant oils. Now, all of this is the extra calories that have been dumped onto the Americans for the last 40 years and has led to the obesity epidemic. So we are really a nation of carboholics. We eat a lot of carbohydrate. So we said we can store only about 100 grams of carbs. So what happens to the rest of the carbs we eat? Okay, so the question is that I said we eat about 300 grams of carbs every day. Since we can store only about 100, and since you can have only 5 grams of carbohydrate in your bloodstream, what happens to the rest of the carbs you eat? So here is another depiction. The total amount of sugars that we can store is really no more than 300 grams. But if you take an average weight person, so this is the weight of the American population back in 1960s, 165 pounds, and I think that's Clark Gable, if I'm not mistaken. And several years later, about 50 years later, an average male is 36 pounds heavier, about 31, 36 pounds heavier. So if you translate that to about 32% body fat, which is average, they have about 63 pounds of fat. So in other words, we have less than a pound of sugar that we can store, but we can store about 60 pounds of fat. Okay, so that's a very important point that I want you guys to understand. Now, I'm going to get to this in a little bit because it'll be presented a little bit later. But I want to tell you a story. And the story is as follows. I said that we are insulin resistant. Right now, you don't understand what insulin resistance is completely. You have a vague thing in your mind that says your insulin levels are high and insulin doesn't work well. So your insulin levels are high and insulin doesn't work well. So the story about insulin resistance starts with Dr. Joseph Kraft. So Dr. Joseph Kraft was a physician in World War II. He practiced for 50 years. And in the course of his lifetime, he did 15,000 glucose tolerance tests. So this is a glucose tolerance test. You go to the lab, you're given about 100 grams of this nasty lemon solution to drink. You drink 100 grams of sugar, and then what happens is that your sugar is measured at 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, and 6 hours. So he measured sugar for 6 hours in these individuals. Now that's what the regular glucose tolerance test is. But Dr. Kraft did something in addition to that. He not only measured sugar levels, but he measured the response of pancreas by pouring out insulin to those sugar levels. So in other words, he measured simultaneous insulin levels. So if you go through a glucose tolerance test, if your blood sugar is less than 140 at the end of 1 hour, you're considered to be normal. 140 to 200, you're pre-diabetic, and over 200, you're a diabetic. So I'd like to submit to you that that's the wrong way to diagnose diabetes. That's the wrong way to diagnose diabetes. Because in the 15,000 tests he did, about 9,500 came out normal. So we're going to take these 9,500 that came out normal, and like I said, he not only measured sugar, but he measured insulin response over time to sugar. So what Dr. Kraft found is that this is the normal response of the pancreas to sugar. In other words, the pancreas is pouring out insulin, and the amount of insulin that is there before you drink the sugar solution is about between 5 and 10. So we measure your insulin response all the time in our office. At about 30 minutes, it went to about 55 to 60 at 1 hour, and over a 5-hour period, it came back down to 5. So this is the normal response of the pancreas to taking 100 grams of sugar. What he found is that this is the normal response, but then there were other people in whom the sugar levels went up quickly to over 100 and didn't quite come back down to normal. That was the group 2. Group 3, it went up to about 150 and it was delayed, but did come back to normal like the first 2 groups. And there is group 4 in whom the insulin levels went even up to 200, but delayed a little bit and stayed up. It was high to begin with, went up and stayed up. Okay? So these are the 4 groups he found in the 9,500 patients in whom he checked the glucose tolerance test. So I'm going to ask you guys one important question. So 9,500 had normal blood sugars. What percentage of this do you think had normal insulin response? It's out there. So the number of people who had normal insulin, despite being classified as non-diabetic in his group, was only about 20%. 70% of these people belonged to one of these categories in which their insulin levels was much higher. So out here is divided. They were pattern 2, pattern 3, and pattern 4. So in other words, if I were to take a group of people here and measure their insulin levels, about 70% of Americans will have high insulin levels. 70% of Americans will have high insulin levels. So type 2 diabetes is an insulin resistant state. Insulin levels are high. High insulin levels promote fat deposition. High insulin levels prevent burning of fat, prevent mobilization of fat. And high insulin levels, as you will see, will cause what I call as toxic hunger. Because when you're obese, your leptin levels are high. Leptin is a hormone that goes and tells your brain, I have too much fat cells, my fat cells are overfilled, don't eat. But if you have high insulin levels, your brain cannot see leptin and it'll make you eat and causes toxic hunger. So when you come to, don't look at the slide in detail, you can look at me. This is what is called HOMA IR. So when you come to our office, me and my office, especially Shalini, I don't know where she is, there she is. She checks your insulin resistance, she checks your HOMA IR. So excellent HOMA IR is less than 1. If it is greater than 2, you are resistant. The American average is about 1.75. So why is HOMA IR important? HOMA IR means that your insulin levels are high. It's a simple, basic thing. So just by looking at HOMA IR, people with high HOMA IR are much greater risk of becoming diabetic, having strokes, getting cancers, getting dementia, and getting heart attacks. So reducing your HOMA IR, which is the goal of our office, is one of the most important things we can do. Okay. Now I talked about toxic hunger from refined carbs. So here is sugar, here is flour, here is the vegetable oil Crisco, and we said this makes the donut. This is sugary fruit, that is bread. When you eat this, your sugar levels go up. When your sugar levels go up, your insulin levels are going to go up. When your insulin levels are high, you will make some glycogen, which is carbohydrate. But what happens to all the extra sugar and carbohydrate that you have eaten? It turns to fat. So your fat cells become larger. And the fat cells will make you make leptin. Leptin goes and tells the brain, stop eating. But if you have high insulin levels, the brain cannot see leptin. So insulin not only regulates sugar, but it regulates the health of the fat cells, and that's what we're going to talk about in detail. It keeps fatty acids, which is breakdown product of triglycerides, and triglyceride levels low in blood. Okay, so we've already said this, that we can store about less than a pound of sugar, but we can store about 60 pounds of fat. Okay, so now we are going to look at fat cells. And looking at fat cells is very important for us, because a fat cell is about 10 microns in size, and it can go up to about 200 microns, so it can increase by 20-fold. So in other words, the volume of the fat cell can increase from one level to about 8,000-fold. So when fat cells increase in size, they can remain healthy to a certain point. This is called fat cell hypertrophy. But when fat cells go beyond their limit of stuffing, in other words, when we eat, we stuff the fat cells. So I want to train you how not to stuff the fat cells. But let's say we keep eating, and what is driving the fat into the fat cells? I want you guys to know that. I want you guys to be engaged to understand what is driving fat into the fat cells. Insulin. So insulin is driving fat into the fat cells, and at some point the fat cells say no more. We have had enough, we are overstuffed. And when they are overstuffed, they die. And when they die, that leads to inflammation. When you go to Shalini, she will check your inflammation markers. She'll say, hey, not only are the triglycerides high in your blood, but your inflammation levels are high. Okay. So amazingly enough, one of two things can happen to fat cells. There are about 10% of us, in whom the fat cells, instead of just enlarging in size, undergo what is called hyperplasia. So I promise you I'm not going to leave anybody behind. The presentation is going to be at the most basic level so that everybody can understand. What hyperplasia means is that instead of the fat cells increasing in size, it divides into small little baby fat cells. So the 10% of us who can cause fat cell hyperplasia remain healthy. They don't get insulin resistant, they don't get inflammation markers. But those of us in whom the fat cells get stuffed and they don't divide, that's where the fat cells get sick and die and attract inflammation. So here is a cute little diagram. Genetics, 10% of us have genetic ability to become obese through adipose tissue hyperplasia. What that means is the fat cells are dividing into many small baby little fat cells. Usually sumo wrestlers are like that. They can get up to 600 pounds, but if you check their blood levels of insulin, they'll be low. If you check their inflammation markers, they will be low. On the other hand, there'll be people, Indian people like me, Chinese people, who get fat at a much lower fat weight. In other words, they're called TOFIs. Thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So the way I think about this is that these people have a very low personal fat threshold, a very low personal fat threshold, and I will get into that in a little bit. So here it is. These are fat cells that are hypertrophied. These two individuals are of the same weight. The people with fat cells that are overfilled are sicker. The people with fat cells that are becoming numerous in number but not increasing in size are healthier. Okay, so we already discussed what drives the fat into the fat cells. So if you have this is a healthy fat cell out here, and it has fat as droplets, little droplets, whereas this one is a big huge droplet of fat and the fat cell is overstuffed. So in order to keep this much fat in the fat cells, how much insulin do you think you need to have? High or low? So as shown out here, insulin levels are very high. So you become insulin resistant if you have overstuffed your fat cells. All right, now I said that when your fat cells get overstuffed, there comes a point at which they say no more, and they start spilling fat into the bloodstream. They start spilling fat into the bloodstream. So here you see baby little fat cells that are cute and healthy. This is an overstuffed fat cell that is pouring fat into the bloodstream, and this fat comes into the liver and into the pancreas, and it causes what is called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It gets deposited in the pancreas and causes diabetes. So fatty liver, right, which is ectopic fat. Our liver is not supposed to have fat, but liver has fat in this case because it's spewing from the fat cells into the circulation. What percentage of American population do you think has fatty liver?
75%.
About 25%. We are obese, but 25% of American population has fatty liver. So this is the sequence of events. This is a normal fat cell. It's getting overstuffed by you eating carbohydrates. I'll talk about fat in a little bit. The fat first goes into the subcutaneous tissue, which is our skin, just underneath our skin. When the subcutaneous tissue is filled up, or in certain people in whom the subcutaneous tissue is deficient, that means people with a low personal fat threshold, like Indian people like me, Chinese people like Sarah. In those people, the fat gets into the viscera, which is inside the organs, or in between the organs in the abdominal cavity. And when the viscera gets filled up, then fat starts spilling into the bloodstream, and then it gets into the liver, into the muscles, into the pancreatic cells, and into the blood vessels. And that's what is causing heart disease, okay? So my entire presentation here would be to explain to you how you can keep your fat cells healthy. What are the mechanisms to keep your fat cell healthy? So this is another schematic diagram. First, fat goes into the subcutaneous adipose tissue, that is underneath the skin. Then it goes into the abdominal cavity in the viscera. Then it spills into the liver, muscles, and heart. And by that time, you have inflammation and you have severe insulin resistance. Okay, so you go to Chana here, or you see Nina, and I don't know where Nina is there. Nina is one of the most intelligent people I've ever seen in my life, because she understands everything that I understand. And sometimes I don't even need to be there, because she'll explain all of this to you guys. So what are the biochemical markers of an overstuffed fat cell? When you come to us, can I tell you whether you have an overstuffed fat cell or no? And the answer to that is yes. I can tell you by looking at your insulin levels. The amount of insulin resistance you have will give an idea. If you have high triglycerides, which is fat and blood, I know that you have overstuffed fat cells. If you have high triglycerides and low HDL, that is another marker. If you have high inflammation markers, if you have high hemoglobin A1C, if you have a fatty liver that you can get through ultrasound, and there are MRI scans that will show you whether you have extra fat.